Computer programming is hard. It's challenging on lots of different levels. Some of them are obvious, many of them aren't. Some of the complexity is sometimes downright sneaky and hard to see until it bites you. So what things can you do to help? Hi, I'm Dave Farley of Continuous Delivery. Welcome to my channel. If you haven't been here before, please do hit subscribe. And if you enjoy the content today, hit like as well. If you do like my content here and would like more information on how to build great software, sign up for my mail list where we regularly publish how-to guides and other information that can help. Today, I want to tell you a story about a software problem that I'm currently working on and try to draw some lessons from it. This isn't a story of how brilliantly everything went and how test-driven development saved the day again. This is about how we tackled the annoying parts, or at least how I do. I've been fighting with some software recently. It's not a very big problem, but it's been one of those annoying, frustrating experiences where it feels like we're fighting to find the exact magic incantation that will unlock the secret door to the result that we really want. This isn't really about design or test-driven development, refactoring or continuous integration. Maybe continuous integration a little bit, but we'll come to that. This is more about the grungy, annoying kind of work that we all face from time to time. So I want to look at how to tackle this kind of problem and what are the traps along the way that we all fall into sometimes. I'm working with a couple of friends on this part-time. The problem itself is really pretty simple, really, but it is the kind of grungy detail that is much more about the plumbing of your system than the real value of it. We recently launched a Patreon community for people who want to support this channel. As one of the perks for members, we have been giving them access to something new, something that we call MSEC, the Modern Software Engineer's Companion. MSEC is a wiki built on top of MediaWiki, the software that Wikipedia runs on. And the idea is to have a curated view of the content that we and others produce that helps people to learn about software engineering in the context of the approach that we discuss on this channel. So we thought it would be a good idea to integrate our Patreon membership with access to MSEC. We'd like people who sign up for Patreon not to have to sign up again for MSEC really. Both pieces of technology support this kind of thing in principle. But at least for MediaWiki, it's open source, and so there are lots of different approaches that people have taken over the years. And as is often the case for open source software like this, some of it was kind of thrown together and doesn't work terribly well and isn't supported anymore. Some of it isn't very good, and some of it is very good, but doesn't quite fit our cases. Other stuff looks like it's close to what we want, but we haven't got it to work yet. None of us that are working on it are deeply familiar with the technologies involved. So already I've waved a few red flags here. We're working on a corner case kind of problem at the margins of what people do with this software in technology that we aren't terribly familiar with, and we're working on it part-time. None of these things are going to make our life any easier. Oh, and at first we were under a self-imposed pressure for a deadline that we eventually missed. Let's start with the things that we did right. We spent time on making our system version controlled and deployable. This is kind of table stakes for me. I've screwed up enough times in the past by not doing this, so that now I've learned that I probably am going to make mistakes, and that when I do, version controls allows me to do that safely. This may sound obvious, but in this case, MediaWiki is a packaged content management system in effect, and the default way of using it never talks about or assumes the use of version control. So we got it running. We got it running in Docker and established a working development approach where we could version and deploy any changes that we cared about. This means that we can bounce changes around between us, run the system locally as well as in production, and all the good things that sensible software developers do. Even though this is a pretty simple system that at this stage we weren't planning to write any software for. This was just so that we could manage configuration changes sensibly. Initially, we didn't think that this change was going to be a big deal. There seemed to be some support for the kinds of things we wanted to do. We had looked at several options and they looked like they'd probably work. I assumed that this would probably take less than a day or two of learning, configuration, tinkering to get all of this working. I'll surprise you, it didn't. Well, actually, it kind of did. Our first attempt worked. We downloaded a couple of MediaWiki plugins and configured them, and we got something that, though not ideal, not what we really wanted, worked. This idea was something of a stopgap while we figured out what we really wanted in a bit more detail and how to make that work. The stopgap worked for a while, and then we had one of those upgrades. We had to take it, it fixed a security vulnerability, and after the upgrade, our working registration approach no longer worked. So I said we'd start with what we got right, so where's the good here? Well, I still think that we made a good choice based on what we knew at the time, and what we needed at the time, even though that choice later turned out to be a problem. You can't sensibly expect to predict the future. Things will surprise us. We didn't have a clear picture of how we wanted this stuff to work, but we wanted to release our stuff and start learning about how we could improve it maybe in other ways. So we did something that we knew would be tactical. A small step that it didn't do all of the things that we wanted, but it got us to a point where we could release our stuff and start learning. I think that this highlights two important ideas in software development more broadly. It's dumb to sit waiting for a perfect solution. Find quick, simple solutions now because they're much valuable than waiting for the perfect solution later. Start learning sooner. When you can, do this in a way that if you do make a mistake, it's easy to undo. Sure, I know that everyone knows this in some form, but companies actually very rarely seem to work this way. Software is frequently planned on the basis of the perfect rather than the expedient. Our user experience isn't what we want it to be yet, but we're working on that, and while we are, people have access to what really matters, the content. Even after the update, existing users were fine. We quickly came up with a simple manual workaround so we could still sign up new users. We were back to stable at least. At this point, we wasted way too much time going down the wrong alley. Initially, before the update, we were getting some intermittent invitation emails being bounced by our mail server, the outbound mail server, saying that they contained some dodgy content. It didn't like the formatted version of the URLs that we were sending out to invite people to sign up. This happened around the same time as the upgrade, and so we assumed that they were related. We started exploring the mail rejection problem, and then we thought that we had a Docker configuration problem around email too. With hindsight, we'd fallen into that all too common trap of jumping to conclusions, and instead of keeping our eye on the ball of what we really wanted, our user registration process, we instead started focusing on this mail problem. This turned out into an exploration of different email providers and all sorts of other blind side alleys that didn't move us forward one little bit. What did move us forward was pausing, reminding ourselves of what our goal really was and refocusing on that, rather than the now shown to be spurious steps in a plan that we now knew to be wrong. The major lesson here, more likely a reminder probably, is that plans never survive first contact with the enemy. Stuff changes that invalidates our plans even if they were previously good plans. The secret is to work in ways that mean that when something changes, you can spot it quickly, you're able to replan without too much loss or delay, and you keep focused on what the goal is rather than the steps in the plan. You can even change the goal based on the new information, but whatever happens, your current best guess of the goal to aim for matters an awful lot more than the steps that you decide are going to get you there. The goal is much more important than the plan, and so the plan should be easy to discard. This is easy to say and hard to do, but it is always true. By this time, we had firmed up on what we wanted the user experience to be a little more. So we looked at some of the solutions that looked as though they may work for us. Actually, there is a Patreon to MediaWiki plugin, which we looked at, but it didn't work with the newer versions of the software, and it didn't quite do all of the things that we wanted to do. This is a slight sidebar, but this makes me think of another common failing at this point. This is a trap that I confess I don't usually fall into anymore, but I have done in the past. But I see lots of teams that still do. Be led by what you want to do rather than what your current technology does. Then figure out how to make the tech do what you need. This can sometimes make your life a little bit more difficult if your tech doesn't do the right things already, but it also means that you are better focused on solving real problems. The implication of this is that when selecting technology, whatever it is, think first about the problem and fit the technology to that, rather than look at the technology and then try and fit the problem to that, which way too many teams do. This second approach is incredibly common. I see it all the time, small teams adopting Kubernetes for simple systems. This may be what they need, but it probably isn't. And in big firms, where what my friends and I used to call golf course architecture often rules. That is, some senior person goes off to play golf with a salesman for a product vendor and comes back saying, all systems will be built with product X from now on because we just got a great deal. This is rarely good for anyone other than the golf playing salesman. Always focus on goals first. Technology is only the tool that we use to achieve them. I had done this. One of the reasons that I chose MediaWiki was because it supported a plugin model, and when I looked initially there seemed to be plugins that did similar kinds of things to what we were likely to need. All good stuff. And worst case, we could write our own plugins. This for me reinforces the importance once again of being able to work incrementally. At the point when I was choosing tech for my little project, I had no idea of all of the things that I wanted to do with it. I still don't, probably, but I looked at it from three perspectives when evaluating it in the first place. First, and this is always first for me, can I version control it? Next, does it look like it does roughly what I want in general terms? In this case, can I make nice looking pages as a wiki and link them to lots of other things? And then, importantly, where does it seem to close doors on me? Where does it make it hard for me to do things that maybe I will want to do in future? I think that playing feature top trumps is a complete waste of time when selecting technology and to be avoided. The plugin model in MediaWiki gave me some level of confidence that we weren't going to be making this mistake, that we could find ready-made fixes for nearly everything that we wanted to do, but also that as a last resort, if we really needed to do niche things, we could probably write our own code. By this time, we knew a bit more about what it was that we wanted, so we decided that what we wanted was a simple registration between Patreon and MSEC. The plugin I mentioned earlier was out because we'd had a look at taking it and updating it, but it relied on an approach that had been superseded in MediaWiki. So we eventually, after lots of attempts to avoid it, started down the path of creating our own plugin. We read up on what we needed to do. The mechanisms to implement a custom OAuth plugin is there, but it's clearly not widely used. Documentation is a bit sketchy and there are no working examples that we could find. No problem, this isn't rocket science. The approach depends on 2 other plugins, so we added those and started getting weird errors. That was before we'd even tried to link to Patreon. First thought was that our configuration was wrong. That's usually the most likely case. But there's a step before this, particularly true for this kind of open source software, assembled from a variety of different sources. Do we know that these versions are actually meant to all work together? So we needed a bit more learning, trawling through repos and bug reports and looking at help pages. This isn't mainstream stuff. It's clearly not widely used. And so the documentation isn't very great. Why should it be? Why would you spend time writing documentation if you've got 3 users? So this was a bit of a chore, but eventually we got the right versions lined up. Still the same error. Damn. This is actually quite common. This wasn't that we hadn't fixed the first problem. We had, and it was essential for us to fix it, but there was more than one problem. This is a nasty situation with these sorts of pieces of work, but quite common. You feel like you're making no progress because practically you aren't. But also, the risk now is that you start floundering around and trying stuff at random. Maybe even losing the gain that you made but didn't recognise as a gain at the time. It's important, vital, to be able to make progress in small steps. And after each small step, figure out if you're closer or further from your goal. To do that, you need to find ways that tell you that you are in fact making some progress or not. At this point, it's very easy to fall into the trap of trying those random things, but don't. Don't just change things until the system works. This is a terrible way to solve problems like this. Instead, have a theory. Try forcing yourself to make a little prediction for each small step. If I change this, I bet the error won't change. That may sound like a dumb test, but a failure like this can rule out the need to explore some dead ends. You're just saying it's definitely not that problem, and that's a good thing to know. What's important here is to find ways to control the variables and to identify the right place to look for results. Up to this point, we'd made the mistake of wandering around in the problem too much. We started by simply running msec in its container and accessing it manually to just reproduce the steps to see the error messages. But now we started being a bit more thorough, a bit more cautious. Instead of just playing with the software, we started to approach our problem solving in a more organised way. We looked for results that more clearly told us in a bit more detail what was going on. We tracked down the logs and started watching them a lot more closely, and now we could see the difference between failures, even when they were reporting the same error message on the UI. We put the code into debug mode and started placing breadcrumb log entries so that we could trace the route of execution through the surrounding code that our code depended on. This helped us to narrow in on the problem. Yes, I know these are obvious things, but sometimes we all forget and get lured to the dark path. If we'd been thinking of this as a development project from the start, I'm fairly sure I would have written some simple acceptance tests to validate things at the start. They sped up my testing a lot. We made the mistake of thinking that this was a simple change, when in reality, given our unfamiliarity with the system, it wasn't, at least not for us. Even though, once we get all the magic incantations correct, there will probably only be a few tens of lines of code at most. Once I got my head in gear, I wrote the simple acceptance tests. So now I can restart the Docker cluster, navigate to msec and try a few different login scenarios reliably and repeatably. It took me an hour or two when I finally got round to this, including writing the infrastructure to support it. Now I can keep better focus on what I really want, which is to see how small changes in the incantation change the response in the system. The problem here is completely psychological. At what point is the effort of working in a more organised way worth it? And the lesson that I've been reminded of and learnt once again from this experience is that it's nearly always worth it sooner than you think. I was being lazy, and so I've ended up doing quite a lot more work as a result of that. I should have learned this lesson by now, but we're all human, at least so far. Writing the test to start with does two things. It focuses your mind on what the problem is, and once you have the test, it keeps you focused on what the problem is. Does the test pass, yes or no? Practically, it also removes the variation. Doing this by hand, I make little mistakes along the way. I do things out of order and I forget whether I did a particular step or not and have to repeat the whole process again for a particular experiment. Deciding how to gather effective, useful feedback matters, maybe even more than that. As soon as you are confused by the results, look for better feedback. What is it that you'd really like to know about the system and figure out how to get that? This all gets us to what I think is the real point of this story. This is what I mean when I talk about working experimentally. Nearly all software development is a process of trial and error. Even more so for this kind of grungy magic incantation work. But that's not a bad thing. Science and engineering are a process of trial and error too. That's really their value. They put some constraints that allow us to explore problems more thoroughly, in a more organised way. We discover reality by trying stuff out and eliminating the ideas that don't work. The reality that we're seeking in this case is the precise incantation that allows these two systems to share authentication information. So we express that need as clearly as we can, ideally in a form of a test. Then we figure out what it is that we need to measure to define progress, and now we start iterating and trying stuff out, step by step, predicting how that's going to pass or fail if it does those things. Preferring the things that seem to move us closer to our goal and discarding the ideas that don't. By adding just a little bit more discipline into our process of exploration, we suffer fewer trials and at least spot the errors more quickly. Oh, and by the way, it's still not working yet. But now we know that we're making real progress because we can see it. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoy my stuff, please consider supporting our work on this channel by joining our Patreon community, and maybe you'll get to see our software working in person. Thank you very much for watching.